The problem with war and violence is evident. Nations have been rivaling one another since the advent of civilizations, even fighting each other in the name of peace, with a trail of blood following humanity's vast history. Clearly, a solution is desperately needed. As human beings, we have a choice to make. We can either choose the treacherous idea of war and violence, or we can choose the high ideal of peace and nonviolence as taught by Jesus. In this speech, we're going to cover the foolishness, the deception, the inefficacies of war and violence, the fear that we experience when attempting to abandon war and violence, and finally, the alternative of Jesus' life and teachings as the only solution to respond to war and violence. The inherent inefficacies and hopeless myopia of war and violence must be abandoned in exchange for the ever-inclusive and peaceable kingdom as found in the teachings and life of Jesus Christ. So first, let us examine war and violence. My first point is the foolishness of war and violence. War was described by the 17th century French philosopher Blaise Pascal in comical fashion. I think you guys are going to like this one. He said, "Can anything be stupider than that a man has the right to kill me because he lives on the other side of a river and his ruler has a quarrel with mine, though I have not quarreled with him?" Clearly, war doesn't always present itself in such a nonsensical fashion as this, though I do believe that's an accurate assessment of war. So let's examine the subject a little closer. Let's notice the deception of war and violence. War is always made to seem noble, purposeful, worthwhile. But this is deceiving, as Dr. Gregory Boyd teaches us. He mentions that all countries try to justify their wars with noble-sounding slogans. Our soldiers fight for God and country, the motherland, honor, justice, truth, equality, freedom, and so on. Soldiers almost always fight for the slogan that they were indoctrinated to believe and for the country they so happen to be born in. Yet even still, many try to find a moral justification for war and violence. However, let us examine the inefficacy of war and violence. I would argue that there may be nothing more absurd than a just war theory. For what just end will a war bring about? What justifies the killing of innocent civilians, I ask? Rome, I believe, is a great example. In the ancient world, they set up the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which they would conquer tribes and nations in different areas, and then they would establish peace after this bloodbath of war and violence. And for a while, it seemed to work. They were a great empire. They established some lasting peace, but eventually it crumbled along with their empire later on in history. Einstein taught us you cannot solve a problem with the same consciousness that created it, suggesting in this case that peace is the only way. We must then examine the fear that we experience in attempting to abandon war and violence. Leo Tolstoy told us about abandoning the fear that we have in abandoning war and violence in his book, The Kingdom of God is Within You. This is actually the book that inspired Gandhi's movement of peace and nonviolence. He said this, by way of analogy: fearing to make the effort to detach ourselves from our perilous position because the future is not fully clear to us, we are like sheep who, terrified that their barn is on fire, huddling in a corner and do not go out the wide open door. But I believe we have three clear and wonderful examples of peace achieving its goals through nonviolence that can help us to move forward in this way. The first being Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi. He was the 19th and 20th century Indian who helped lead the way to India being freed from the British Empire's oppression through nonviolence and peace. Secondly, and more familiar to us, would be Martin Luther King Jr., who in the 60s advocated the abolishment of segregation and was successful in his peaceful attempts. And third and finally, I believe the most important illustration is that of Jesus Christ, whose wide-ranging impact throughout history cannot be underestimated and can barely be articulated with words. It is the life and teachings of Jesus that will only put an end to war and violence, establishing peace. And thus I say the alternative, his alternative, is the only viable response to stopping this endless cycle of war and violence. Brian McLaren, in his book, A New Kind of Christianity, envisions a glimpse of this peaceable kingdom that Jesus talks about. Quoting Isaiah 2 and Isaiah 11, paraphrasing the passages, he writes this: "We should be dreaming about tanks being melted down into playground jungle gyms, and machine guns being recast as swing sets. Christians and Jews and Muslims throwing a picnic together, or lefties and right-wingers forming a band and singing in harmony, or nuclear weapons engineers being redeployed to develop green energy. To culminate this speech, I want to quote Jesus' words, which are the inspiration for these ideas and thoughts, and I believe are central to this. He says this in the Gospel of Matthew: "Do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you." So this is not a roll over and die, bend over and take it pacifism that Jesus necessarily advocates, but living out an active, thoughtful, nonviolent, and peaceful response to resolve our conflicts. Perhaps instead of dropping bombs, we can offer ways to help those who are in our common human struggle. Instead of pulling out a gun to shoot, perhaps we could pull out our wallet and seek to give and relieve some economic hurts. Or perhaps instead of words of hate, we could offer words of encouragement, grace, edifying, and building up people. These are just a few examples, but these show that there are viable, peaceful options to respond to the opposition of war and violence. So to summarize, the inherent inefficacy and hopeless myopia of war and violence must be abandoned in exchange for the ever-inclusive and peaceable kingdom found in the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. We've explored the foolishness, the deception, the inefficacy of war and violence, the fear that we experience in attempting to abandon war and violence, and finally, the alternative of Jesus' life and teachings as the only viable option in order to degrade and to move away from war and violence. So it's my prayer and hope that we would all choose the way of Jesus, peace and nonviolence. Cool.
If I could whistle, I would.
What does this word myopia mean?
Inefficacy.
Inefficacy.
Inefficacy, like